This meeting is titled Rosa Luxemburg, Clara Zetkin, Sylvia Pankhurst, the women who fought against World War I. And we have Katherine Connelly, author of the most recent biography of Sylvia Pankhurst, which is a really great read and uncovers a lot of new material. And it's from Pluto Press. We've got copies here, so do check that out. And Kate is a member of Counterfire, an activist in Stop the War. I myself work for Stop the War Coalition in the National Office as an organiser, so I'm happy to keep chairing this meeting. Kate's going to talk for half of the meeting, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions after that. And I think that is it, so I'll hand over to Kate.
Okay, well thank you ever so much everybody. I think in many ways this meeting follows on from the meeting yesterday. I don't know if everybody went to it, but from the meeting that Neil Faulkner did yesterday about the First World War. And, do you want to...
How's that for the sound? Okay.
Very good, cool. So yeah, I think this meeting does very much follow on from an analysis of the attempt by Michael Gove and by this government to rewrite the history of the First World War and essentially to tell a very different story to the one that we've got used to. And in a sense, this is not kind of as new as it might at first appear. Although there has been kind of a big offensive, Gove taking on Blackadder, notably, and what's sort of been coming across in the news recently. But I think really this has been prepared, this kind of ideological assault on the First World War has been prepared in academia for quite some time. Certainly the undergraduate history course on the First World War at Queen Mary's is titled Winning on the Western Front, Britain in the First World War, which I think is deeply problematic and suggests that the important thing about the First World War is that Britain won, and that somehow this was some great victory, and sort of kind of goes along with the narrative really that the essential divide in the First World War was really between nations, and that's what we need to focus on in remembering the history of it. So I want to talk about a very different history of the First World War, about three women who became some of the most prominent anti-war voices at the time. And I want to discuss what they represent and what that tells us about the First World War. So here are the women that I'm going to be discussing. Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Sylvia Pankhurst. So Clara Zetkin was the oldest of the three of them, and she'd been a leading member of the German Socialist Party, which was called the Social Democratic Party, and I'm going to refer to it really just by its initials as the SPD. So she'd been a leading member of this organisation. That was the largest and most influential socialist party in Europe at the time. And her sort of emphasis, she put particular importance in organising women workers and engaging women in the struggle for socialism. So she was the editor of the SPD's women's magazine, and in 1910 it was Clara Zetkin who founded what's now called International Women's Day, but was initially called International Working Women's Day. Rosa Luxemburg, who we see with her here, were very close friends, had been a prominent socialist theorist, one of the leading socialist theorists since her early 20s, both in her native Poland and in Germany, in the SPD, Germany where she later moved to. And one of the things that Rosa Luxemburg particularly addressed in her writing, she very much took on many of the established figures who were seen as the leading figures in the SPD. And herself as a revolutionary socialist, she took on the ideas of people like Kautsky, who was even called the Pope of Marxism by some people. This is how, was seen as this kind of leading theorist. And she took on people like Edward Bernstein as well, again, another leading theorist in the SPD. Bernstein, who was essentially saying that the struggle for socialism could be achieved by people in the SPD getting elected, and then they could tinker about with the system, propose some reforms, and a small group of people, essentially, by getting elected, could make everything better for everybody else. Rosa Luxemburg wrote passionately and on many occasions to challenge this view, and her view was that socialism really could only come from below, that it had to be the vast majority of working people had to be engaged in this project for social emancipation and for the kind of social change that socialists wanted to see. So that was one aspect of the theory. She really defended the idea that Karl Marx put forward, that the emancipation of the working class has to be the act of the working class itself. So that was one of the kind of key things that she was writing about before the First World War. One of the other challenges that she took up, one of the other viewpoints that she wanted to attack, the SPD was, like socialist parties across Europe, were involved in this organisation that grouped them together so they could organise together, meet and discuss. And that was called the International. And in the International, there were some people and some representatives of some socialist parties who basically thought that their imperialism could sometimes benefit the people that it colonised, and they tried to sort of play up what they saw as some of the benefits of colonialism. Within Rosa Luxemburg's own party in the SPD, there was Kautsky, who I've just referred to, and he believed that really imperialism was becoming much less important to capitalism than it had been previously. And he was arguing this was the way things were going to go. That imperialism really wasn't something that the left had to spend very much time combating, because actually people would realise, that even the ruling powers would realise that it was getting in the way of their ability to run things smoothly. And similarly, there was Edward Bernstein, who had a similarly complacent attitude to the idea that war could break out in the early 20th century, that these big global conflicts, he argued, were a thing of the past. That essentially, again, very much a sort of similar argument to what Kautsky was saying about imperialism, that the capitalists would realise it wasn't in their interest to have these big, destructive wars where things would get blown up and all of these things would be huge forces engaged in this incredibly destructive activity. Rosa Luxemburg completely challenges this. She draws on the works of Marx, but uses and updates them to look at the new situation. And essentially what she says is this: Marx was right, that capitalism is a system that has to constantly expand, has to constantly find new markets, and will do that by any means that it has to. And that as a system that essentially has to expand all of the time and grab new markets, it's a system that constantly creates competition between nation states, between companies. And she saw that far from these things of war and imperialism becoming less important to capitalism, this was going to be very much more a central feature of capitalism in the 20th century. That capitalism inevitably brings these forces into contradiction with each other, and therefore the fight against capitalism, the fight for the overthrow of capitalism, had to centrally address the questions of fighting war and imperialism as well. And now I'm going to move on to Sylvia Pankhurst. So Sylvia Pankhurst, unlike the other two, doesn't emerge from the Marxist tradition of thought initially. She comes from a sort of radical middle-class family in Manchester. And her family, her mother, Emmeline Pankhurst, and her older sister, Christabel Pankhurst, together created what was called the militant suffragette movement. So a group of women who campaigned for the right to vote in Britain. And what marked out their campaign was their use of direct action and civil disobedience to draw attention to their cause and as a tactic for campaigning. Now, although the suffragette movement starts off as a movement that's very much linked with the labour movement in this country and the socialist movement, what her sister Christabel Pankhurst, who was, as I said, one of the leading figures in the campaign, starts to do is very swiftly move that campaign away from any contact with the socialist or labour movement. And one of the arguments that she uses to do this is the argument that working class women, their lives are so hard, they're so horrible, they're so poor, they've probably got so many children, they're too ill to fight for their own rights, they're far too weak to campaign for their own rights, they can't possibly do this. And what Sylvia Pankhurst argues is that really it's the duty of the richer, more influential women in society to campaign on behalf of their poorer sisters. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst is deeply uncomfortable with this. Sylvia Pankhurst defines herself as a socialist in her early life. But what gives her the confidence to start to challenge her, this was her own family after all, but what starts to give her the challenge to confront the politics of her older sister and her mother and where the whole suffragette movement was going, is actually contact with workers in struggle. She goes on a tour of the United States to promote the militant suffragette movement, meets workers campaigning there, and crucially in this country, from 1910 right up to the outbreak of the First World War, this country saw a huge wave of strikes that swept the country. Workers who'd previously been written off their whole lives, they were told that, again, very similar to the argument that Sylvia Pankhurst was coming out with, these workers had been seen as the lowest of the low, they were too poorly paid, their conditions were too bad, they weren't generally in a union, they'd never be able to stand up for themselves, this was the argument. But from 1910 to 1914, these were the workers that really kind of shook up the movement in this country, took what would be called wildcat strike action now, and in their thousands went on strike. And Sylvia Pankhurst really sees that far from being the weakest section of people in society, that actually women like these are women who went on strike in South London in 1911, thousands of women who worked in the jam factories and the biscuit packing factories, all of those on the dockside. And they brought South London to a complete standstill. And Sylvia Pankhurst really sees that working women, far from being the weakest, actually have this extraordinary power that's unique to their class, that they can unite together and stop production and potentially bring the whole country to a standstill. And it's that that Sylvia Pankhurst wants to bring into the suffragette movement. She wants to use the weapon of the strike to bring about political gains, which she hopes will bring about the kind of social gains that people wanted to see. And in this, she very much sees that workers from all countries have far more in common with each other, through this ability to unite together, than they did with their own rulers. And really the tipping point for this comes in 1913, when workers in Ireland had been locked out by their employers and basically told, you're not coming back to work until you renounce your membership of a union. So basically threatening to starve people out of their right to organise collectively. Sylvia Pankhurst speaks at the Albert Hall. There's a mass meeting called in the Albert Hall in solidarity. And she speaks in support of the workers in Ireland and says that the workers in Ireland who are fighting for their freedom, and the women in Britain who are fighting for their freedom, and the trade unionists who are standing up, and indeed workers like this who are standing up to employers who are attacking them, the state that's attacking them, all have far more in common with each other, and that they need to unite against the British government. Now, that is kind of far too much for her older sister to tolerate, and Sylvia Pankhurst is expelled from the main militant suffragette organisation. So what she goes on to do, she's expelled in January 1914, so this is very shortly before the outbreak of the First World War, but what she goes on to do is to work with women like this. She goes to the East End of London, the poorest part of London at the time, and brings those women into the campaign to fight for their political rights. And she, as I said, really tries to galvanise the energy and the power of these women who were taking action in the East End, and fuse those demands to change things economically in the workplace with the political demand for the vote, with the social changes, the fight against poverty that these women wanted to see. So this is one of my favourite pictures of the kind of women. You can kind of see the energy and the dynamism of these women, and why it was so useful for the suffragettes, and why it was so right for them to link up with these kind of women. These are women, again, just in a packing factory in East London, and they've gone on strike. There was something like 1,000 women in this packing factory. They went on strike and they tango danced down the streets in East London. They ran a big, lively political campaign, and many of these women became suffragettes. So this is where these three women are in 1914. And I think there's some important parallels between these women, despite some of the differences. They were all, as women, three leading political campaigners in a society which denied women even their very basic political rights. They were also incredibly courageous women who experienced, at the very sharp end, what it was like to be faced with repression by the state. Clara Zetkin was forced into exile after the German Chancellor in the late 1870s, in 1878, passed the anti-socialist laws, which effectively banned socialist activity. So she was forced into exile for years from her own country. Rosa Luxemburg was arrested and imprisoned on several occasions. There's her police photographs. Including once actually for insulting the Kaiser. And Sylvia Pankhurst, of course, is famous for being regularly imprisoned as a suffragette. And you can see her here, she's recovering from a hunger strike. She was repeatedly force-fed. So all of them understood what it was to face state repression. But all three, I think most importantly about all of them, is all three were committed to the idea of fighting for liberation from below. They believed it was the vast majority of people who were going to achieve these changes. It wasn't going to be a small elite. And they also took very seriously the question of imperialism. Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg, and Sylvia Pankhurst, who allies with workers in Ireland and later, in fact, across the British Empire, and says that these people deserve their freedom and that their struggle is part of the same struggle as the struggle for women's liberation. So what happens in 1914? Well, in 1914, the International that I've referred to, this big organisation that brought together socialist parties from across Europe, is pledged to oppose war on the outbreak if a war was to break out. They talked about organising general strikes across Europe. And the women's movement as well also pledged itself to oppose war. But what happens on the 4th of August is that the difference between the verbal rhetoric and the verbal radicalism of people and the actual substance of their politics becomes exposed. And one of the most devastating blows comes on the 4th of August when the SPD group in the German parliament votes unanimously to give war credits to the government. And this is the biggest, most influential group on the socialist left in Europe. And for them to do this, for them to side with the national government and to say they agreed that there ought to be a social peace, that is, this party so-called of the left told workers they shouldn't be going on strike, they shouldn't be doing anything to disrupt the war effort, and they vote to give war credits to the government. And this is seen as so shocking and so devastating that when Lenin, the leader of the Bolsheviks, reads this in a newspaper, he believes this is a forgery, this is something produced by the German police as propaganda. But unfortunately, this was very, very true. In Britain, exactly the same thing happened, essentially. Just 2 days before the war broke out, there was an anti-war demonstration, and because it was a demonstration in London, even in August, it's pouring the rain. But this was the demonstration 2 days before the First World War broke out. And the very people, even people that spoke on that platform, became people who just, as soon as the war broke out, called on workers to support the national government. At this meeting, they were supporting a manifesto that read, "Down with class rule, down with the rule of brute force, down with the war." Among those who spoke was Will Thorne, who was seen as one of the leaders of the trade union movement in the 1880s, a radical figure that people had looked up to in the trade union movement, who knew Eleanor Marx and had worked closely with Eleanor Marx, the daughter of Karl Marx. He spoke at that meeting, and after the war broke out, he became Lieutenant Colonel of the West Ham Volunteer Force. So he basically became a recruiting sergeant for the First World War. Arthur Henderson, who was a Labour politician, spoke at that meeting after the war breaks out. In 1915, he joins the national government, the government that is engaging Britain in the war, and it's him that negotiates with the trade unions, with the working class movement to drop their right to strike. So instead of it being down with class rule, in fact this was down with class conflict as far as some of the people that spoke at this meeting were concerned. In the women's movement, similar things happened. The peaceful suffrage campaigners, the ones who didn't use direct action or civil disobedience, they'd called a meeting actually on the 4th of August, the day that war broke out. When it became clear that Britain was going to go to war, some of them wanted to cancel it, and they rewrote all the resolutions. So the resolutions that urged women to work against war and for peace were actually rewritten to say women in countries that aren't already engaged in war. And they called on women to, as they said, offer their services to their country, so basically to support the war effort. The main militant suffragette campaign, the campaign that Sylvia Pankhurst had just been expelled from, became virulently patriotic. They changed the name of their newspaper from the Suffragette to Britannia, which pretty much tells you all you need to know, really. And they organised big demonstrations demanding that the government give women more work in the First World War, and that there would be more women invited into the munitions factories so they could produce more shells to prosecute the war more vigorously. So that's what their efforts were spent doing. And the three women that I'm talking about were among the very first people across Europe to resist this drive to war. The very same evening, despite how devastating a blow it was when the SPD voted for war credits, the very same evening, Rosa Luxemburg organises a meeting of people in the SPD who were at the time a very, very small minority, feeling incredibly isolated and very demoralised. She calls a meeting in her apartment and says they've got to organise together to produce anti-war propaganda and to oppose what their own party has done. And this group, although she wasn't there at that meeting because she wasn't living in Berlin, but this is the group that Clara Zetkin also comes to support. And through organising, they create confidence. They create a little group and they begin to create their own publications. And they start writing these articles, they start publicising, they start putting the argument out about why it was wrong for the SPD to support the war. And you can tell the difference, what difference it made on the confidence of anti-war activists by looking at the difference between August and December 1914. In August, 4th of August 1914, unanimous vote from the SPD representatives in the German parliament for war credits. By the 2nd of December 1914, it's only one, but it is one of these representatives, Karl Liebknecht, who actually has the courage to stand up and vote against the SPD. And this has a huge effect on the movement across Europe, despite the fact this was only one person. The fact that he voted against his party and said there was a class interest, here he is actually speaking at a meeting denouncing the war, the fact that he said there was a class interest, that you didn't have to go along and support the war, has huge effects across Europe. Sylvia Pankhurst reports the statement that he put out about why he was going to vote against the war credits. She publishes that in her newspaper. So important did she think this message was for workers in Britain. So as I said, this group, they created their own publications, Die Internationale, and they printed in that arguments against war and arguments against the capitulation of the SPD. And one of the first articles that Rosa Luxemburg writes was to take on our old friend Kautsky, who came out with something else after the outbreak of war, which was to say that the International, this organisation of socialist and left parties across Europe, he said that the International was only relevant as a body which raised the question of class struggle. That was only relevant in peacetime. In wartime, everything, of course, was totally different. And Rosa Luxemburg, again, referring back to the tradition of Karl Marx and that tradition of internationalism, says this about the position that Kautsky had taken. She said, in Kautsky's rendering, the world historical appeal of the Communist Manifesto has been subjected to a substantial amendment, and now reads, proletarians of all countries unite in peacetime. but slit one another's throats in war. So very clearly she's saying this has nothing to do with Marxism, this has nothing to do with internationalism, and she's imprisoned during the First World War. For most of the First World War, actually, Rosa Luxemburg spends in prison for her anti-war activities. And in prison in 1915, she writes what became known as the Unionist pamphlet. That's because she wrote it under a pseudonym. She was writing it in prison. She smuggled it out of the prison and published it under the name Unionist. But the actual title was The Crisis in German Social Democracy, and was a critique of the way that the SPD had acted with regard to the war. And what she says in that very important pamphlet is that the SPD forgot its internationalist principles at the very moment they needed to remember them, when they were most relevant, that this was what all these international principles were for, that they were supposed to come into play to oppose war, to oppose workers being divided amongst themselves. And she would go on to reiterate, she wrote something called the Guiding Principles of the Spartacus League. And the Spartacus League is what emerged out of Die Internationale. And she said this: imperialism, the last and highest development of the political rule of capitalism, is the deadly enemy of workers of all countries. And what she's saying there is that the war is diametrically opposed to the interests of working class people. Now, Sylvia Pankhurst, as I've said, is in quite a different situation to the German socialists. She's obviously just established her small group in the East End of London, consisting of working class suffragettes, who she's been working with as activists for about 2 years. Now, interestingly, when the war breaks out, Sylvia Pankhurst is actually in Ireland, and she's reporting there for her newspaper on the way that the British Empire is treating people in Ireland, and she's trying to expose how awful that is, and to win support for Irish workers, and which very much, I think, underlines her commitment to internationalism. But when she comes back from Ireland a few days later, after war's broken out, she discovers that some of the women that she's been working alongside for so many years are pro-war. They've heard all this stuff about defending poor little Belgium, a myth that was, I think, very effectively taken apart yesterday. But they've heard all this propaganda, and we know that the effect that this very often has on people, and many of them were saying, oh no, maybe we should be supporting the war. Now, for Sylvia Pankhurst, it's not a question of breaking with this organisation. These are not people, the people that she's organising amongst, who for 20 years have been arguing they need to throw out Marxist principles or anything like that. These are ordinary working class women who've become activists, some of whom were very young and become activists for the first time in their lives, many of them. But of course, to some extent, this hampers the potential for Sylvia Pankhurst's anti-war activity. So what she does as a tactic is try to put into place the kind of thing that Rosa Luxemburg was arguing, that it's not in working class interests to support the First World War. And so what she does is show, she puts big emphasis on showing the way that the war is being prosecuted. It is effectively demanding a very, very high price for the working class, and no sacrifice, or virtually no sacrifice from the ruling class. 10. Oh, fuck. Okay. So, yeah, because, I mean, when the war broke out, the British government did a kind of, we're all in this together, that David Cameron would just dream of. I mean, they really did argue that all classes were in this together. They all had to sacrifice together. Everybody had to make some sacrifices. And what Sylvia Pankhurst's efforts are put towards in the first years of the war are exposing the extent to which this is a complete lie, that in fact it's working class people who are paying this hugely high price. So what she does is create campaigns to demand that there's a democratic control of the food prices, so that people can't profiteer out of the food prices. She calls for equal pay for women, which was a very important demand, because as the men were sent off to the front and women started to fill the jobs in the factories or started to make the munitions. The employers were just rubbing their hands with glee, hearing all these women they could pay even worse than they've been paying the men. So she ran campaigns against the exploitation of women workers, and they organised demonstrations against sweated labour. And Sylvia Pankhurst saw there was a kind of underlying anti-war logic to this. She said, if we can make the employers lose instead of making profits, we bring the war to an end. So that's what they did, and very quickly that transforms her organisation by emphasising that there is a huge difference in class interests. That transforms her organisation into an anti-war organisation quite quickly. By 1916, they're holding peace meetings across London, and in Poplar, just down the road, suffragettes disrupted National Service Week and were being thrown out of these rallies that were telling everybody to join the army. I just want to talk about partly how building this anti-war movement involved rejecting the very powerful and very seductive propaganda at the time that wasn't just coming from the government and the employers. But as I've said, because sections of the left and sections of the feminist movement were supporting the war, they tried to give their support for the war this kind of either sort of socialist or feministy kind of gloss to this pro-war propaganda. In Germany, the SPD presents this war as a war against the British Empire, the deviousness of the British Empire, which they somewhat pompously called perfidious Albion, and also against the reactionary Tsarist regime in Russia. And that they also sort of tried to present this as a war to defend the rights of the poor minorities in the Russian Empire who were being oppressed. Their main theoretical organ, their theoretical publication called Neue Zeit, this claimed that in Russia, the Poles and the Jews, and I quote, live and toil, hoping and longing that German rifles carried by German men will crush the whole Tsarist system. So basically they're saying the minorities in Russia are crying out for these German men with their German guns. And Rosa Luxemburg, it should be pointed out, who was both Polish and Jewish, fiercely criticises this idea that the German state that has put her in prison is the state that is going to liberate the national minorities in Russia. And this is very, very important because Rosa Luxemburg is committed to this idea that people liberate themselves. They don't need to be liberated, and they indeed can't be liberated by these imperial powers. And this was the logical conclusion from her very strong anti-imperialist politics. Obviously in Britain, they did exactly the same kind of propaganda, they just switched who the enemy was. So the propaganda in Britain presented Germany as this ruled by this horrible, oppressive Kaiser, and the feminists presented Germany as this kind of horrible male state, trampling all over female Belgium. The Britannia represented this sort of virtuous and wronged woman who had to come to her aid, and all this kind of stuff. And Sylvia Pankhurst combats all this barrage of propaganda against how awful, how exceptionally awful the regime in Germany is, not by presenting a balanced view that says, yes, well, the British government are really bad, and so is the Kaiser, and everybody's really bad, and oh, it's so awful. If you read her newspaper, which initially was called the Woman's Dreadnought, later becomes called the Workers' Dreadnought, there's hardly any mention of the Kaiser in there. There's hardly any mention of the wicked German government and all the terrible things that they do to socialists, despite the fact that, of course, Sylvia Pankhurst opposed the kind of policies that the German government had been imposing, and had opposed them for a lot longer than the British government had done. Her ire, her anger is focused on what the British government are doing, how they are sending out working people in Britain to suffer, how they are letting the exploiters, the profiteers, come in at a time of war and use that chaos to basically just completely exploit people and see the rents rocketing and the prices rising and all these kind of things. That is where her anger is focused. And so all of them really adopted the approach that Karl Liebknecht suggested when he said the main enemy is at home. And that is what it meant. That's what it meant by putting that into practice. And by saying the main enemy is at home, also what they meant is that we've got to confront that enemy. We've got to create a mass movement that can bring this war to an end. All of these women, all of these women believed that the war could not be stopped but through a mass movement, and they were vindicated. the mass movement did, in fact, there was a woman working, I was going to show that. This is how the First World War was stopped. It wasn't stopped through the great wisdom of great leaders who were just going to see this war prosecuted seemingly almost endlessly. The war was stopped through revolution. It was stopped through a mass movement. It was started in Russia by women workers who were marching over the extortionate price of bread, and transforms into mutinies by soldiers and strikes of workers that brings down the repressive Tsarist government. There's then a second revolution, a much more socialist revolution that's headed up by the Bolshevik Party that demands that Russia withdraws from the war, that actually the social gains that people like this who marched wanted to see had not been delivered by the government they put in place. And that is what draws Russia out of the war. It's mutinies in the German Navy initially, but then strikes and mutinies across Europe, particularly in Germany, that pulls Germany out of the war. So they were absolutely right about these things. And I think when I talk about what the message is for today, why it's important to talk about these things today, we've had a lot of debates here about how the Stop the War movement today should be approaching events. And some people have said that the Stop the War movement essentially should condemn all sides, should put equal emphasis on condemning what Russia is doing, as well as what the British government is doing and what NATO is doing, and should really essentially condemn all sides as nasty imperialist powers. I think that this kind of history shows us that those who wanted to stand above it and condemn everybody actually were completely ineffective when the First World War came about. The anti-war movement created by these women, many other people as well, but these women are some of the examples of people who very early on saw what was going to happen and saw the need to create organisations and an anti-war movement. That it's these people who adopted the slogan of the main enemy is at home, who understood what that meant, who created anti-war movements in incredibly difficult circumstances, were able to create very powerful movements in their own country. And I think what this comes down to really is this, and it comes back to Marx, who all of these women referred to very much. Clara Zetkin and Rosa Luxemburg, all of their lives. By the end of the First World War, Sylvia Pankhurst has become a revolutionary socialist. She starts to read Karl Marx in the First World War. And it comes down to this, that Marx said that hitherto philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point is to change it. And I think these women very much wanted to change it, and that's what their political practice is about.
Thank you, Kate. That was great. So we've got plenty of time for questions, just under half an hour. So yeah, if you just show hands, I'll take them in groups of like bunches of 3 or something. And then we can come back and turn, yeah. Okay. Well, any comments or points? And I can start you off with one, which kind of just goes back. Can people hear me without a mic? Yeah, just goes back to the beginning of your talk when Sylvia Pankhurst started reaching out to women in the East End, and what that process really looked like and how that was for us. Because we know even as as activists and even working class activists know that reaching the most kind of hard to reach, as it were, can be incredibly daunting sometimes if you think of like young black or urban youth or groups like that. And I was just wondering, what was her experience? How did she go about this? Really?
Yeah, it's an interesting one because it was in a way even harder for the suffragettes, because by like 1912, which is when she goes to the East End to create an organisation there, the suffragettes have got such a terrible reputation amongst working class people, because essentially I talked a little bit about the kind of attitude towards working women that they had, that they were these poor passive little victims who needed sort of saving, but their politics were incredibly the leadership of the mainstream suffragette movement by that time were incredibly right-wing and very sort of elitist. And so initially when Sylvia Pankhurst goes to the East End, there's actually quite a bit of hostility from some workers. There are some women, though, who have heard about how brave the suffragettes are. And so they sort of defend the suffragettes when they first come to the area and say, no, they are really brave, and they do see them as these anti-establishment figures. So there's kind of a tension there between people that really admire them and people who just think that they're, you know, basically up to just votes for ladies, which some of them were. So when she goes to the East End, she's always, very much Sylvia Pankhurst's political practice was always about listening to people and not about just talking at them. And so what she does, first of all, she comes down kind of as a journalist, and she interviews people about their lives. And she then reports the things that they want changed in their lives. So whereas a lot of the suffragettes were arguing that the suffragettes shouldn't deal with any other issues other than the vote, Sylvia takes a totally opposite approach, and she goes like door to door, and this is what they started to do when they set up their own organisation. They'd pick a street, they'd knock on every door, they'd interview the women about their lives, they'd argue with them about how the vote could help them change this. But they'd then report that in their newspaper, and they'd take up these campaigns. So that was sort of one way.